Tember, tier list Tember, tier list Tember, tier list Tember.
Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, welcome to Tier List Tember, where today I'm taking on every Nintendo console and handheld tier list. I will be ranking them based on how good I think the consoles were in general, how great the game selection was, and just general mass appeal. Now, I will say there is one console on here that I don't know what it was. There was a couple at first, but a lot of deep diving allowed me to find it. But this specific type of DS, I don't know what model it is, because if you look down here, we've got the basic DS, and then the revised DS here, and then we have the DSi. So I don't know what this is, but yeah. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say, so let's get on with the tier list. First up, we have the very first Nintendo video game thing, which was the TV game line of consoles, technically. Basically what they were little boxes that you plugged into the TV, and each one that you plugged in had a different game alongside of it. But considering that there were only 5 released, I think, and 2 of them were tennis, they're not amazing. At the time, they didn't really have much purpose, because while they seemed to be fun little doodads, you could also pick up an Atari as well, and with Atari, you could swap out cartridges. Now, I have never played a TV game 15 or 6 or any of the other different models, but I don't really think I'm missing out on much. I firmly believe that this is forgotten for a reason, because even this tier list did not have an image for this console. I had to grab one from the Nintendo Wiki. So, yeah, that is a bit of a stinker for the start. And then, following up with that, we have the 2 Game & Watch designs. Now, this is basically like a portable version of the TV game series. The only difference is that they were portable, and just like the TV game, most of them had buttons directly on the console themselves. You didn't really have controllers. These I'm a little more favorable towards, not just because Mr. Game & Watch from Smash Bros., but also it makes a bit more sense to purchase a small little portable device in the 70s and 80s to just have something to play on the go, rather than the TV game series, which kind of just seemed outdated already. The 2 different consoles don't change much, it's just this had a flip-open design for certain games, and would later go on to inspire the Nintendo DS. But yeah, I think that these are okay games, you know. Nowadays, I don't think anyone is looking to go back and play these outside of just the novelty of, oh hey, this is what gaming used to be. But they made sense at the time, and they didn't age terribly. Also, they didn't rip off Pong. Now here's what everyone has been looking for. The Famicom. The very first Nintendo console that we think about it as such. And the Famicom was huge. Like, even during back then, the Famicom and the NES were massive, and I don't think that needs to be elaborated on anymore, in the fact that Nintendo was actually able to become a gaming company during the infamous crash of video games that was happening around that time. It was definitely happening more in America, I believe, than in Japan, but it was still a issue. Now, as for the console itself, I've never played with one myself, but I do know plenty about it, and it was basically a perfect first try, and only had very minor flaws. Like, for instance, I don't know if you know about this, but on the Player 2 controller, you didn't have a select or start button, because where those buttons would be was instead a microphone. I don't think this was used for anything, or at the very least, if it did have any use, I am not aware of such information. But yeah, not only did you have cartridges, so you could swap out and play different games, unlike this piece of junk, you also had a 2-player right out the box, and it was honestly just really cool. Now, I will say it did have some flaws, like the aforementioned microphone, but also the controllers are attached directly to the console, which not only did they have a short cord, so you couldn't, like, sit on the couch quite a far distance away, you had to basically be sitting in front of your TV, but if something happened to your controller, then you would be kind of out of luck, because again, you couldn't easily, or maybe not at all, replace the controllers. But for Nintendo's first major console release, absolutely amazing. And the only reason I don't feel like putting it in Sublime System is because I haven't really had access to it, but it had so many amazing and timeless games that we still go back to today that it cannot be understated how awesome this truly was. And then we're going to follow that up with the Famicom Disk System, which was a attachment where you'd push it onto your Famicom and click them together, and then you could insert floppy disks into the console to use them to read games. This was, I believe, for games that were slightly more storage advanced than what normal Famicoms were capable of, or for swappable games. There used to be kiosks until 2003 where you could take a Famicom-approved floppy disk, and you could go in and insert the floppy disk into the machine, and it would download a brand new game onto there. So one cartridge could technically be a couple different games. And so it's very interesting. It's not quite as amazing because, well, this is, I believe, where the Legend of Zelda series and the Metroid series got their start. I think it is just slightly worse than the Famicom, mostly because any issues I have with the Famicom would also apply to this, and just having to purchase an additional accessory to play specific games sounds kind of annoying. And then we have the Twin Famicom. Basically what this was a Famicom with a bit of extra built-in RAM that could only run disc games, and it was made by a company other than Nintendo. But other than that, it's basically just a Famicom disk drive. It's okay. The controllers on this are super weird, by the way. They look like standard Nintendo controllers with the D-pad and the A and B buttons, but they also have turbo built in, and that's kind of weird. Like, I associate turbo with, like, aftermarket controllers, you know? It's an interesting little console. I wonder if it would have been better at the time to own both a Famicom and a Twin Famicom, or a Famicom and a Famicom disk driver. Though, considering that I am not a Japanese console buyer in the 1980s, I can't really answer that. And then we have the console. There is a reason why, to many parents and many people in general, all video game consoles are Nintendos, because this thing was big. Plus, as far as I can tell on the internet, the NES outsold the Famicom. Plus, any issues that I've had previously with the Famicom are entirely gone with the NES. The controllers have a longer cord, the controllers are also detachable, so if your controller breaks, you don't need to buy a new console just to play your games again. Additionally, since the cartridges were redesigned, games that were once Famicom disc only, like The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, could now be played on the standard NES. Additionally, instead of having Player 1 and Player 2 controllers like the Famicom had, so Player 2 didn't have Select and Start, both controllers were exactly the same. so either player could pause or select. And this is absolutely amazing. The NES is an icon of gaming and is one of the best video game consoles ever. But that's not to say that it didn't have its problems as well. Most infamously, the connector pins that would read your games when you inserted the cartridge could wear out and become dirty easily. So that led to many NESs not being able to read games amazingly, which ironically enough would facilitate the need to purchase another console. Additionally, while many of the games from Japan came over here, and there were even one or two exclusives, many of the games that did come over here from Japan had translation errors or just straight up completely different translations. Like sometimes they would even go in and change the sprites for a game just to be a different game entirely. Very strange, I know. But overall, I cannot sing enough praises for the console that, as generic and cliche as this sounds, brought the world back into playing video games. It's a sublime system, and while it has its faults, it's really good. Really, really good. Then we have the Top Loader NES. The Top Loader NES is virtually the exact same console as the baseline NES, but, as you might imagine by the name, it loads games in from the top. This actually meant that it didn't need the connector pins as seen in the VCR-styled box from above, so games would actually be easier to load in. Additionally, it came with a controller redesign that made it more comfortable to hold, although it also made the buttons a bit weirder to press. Considering that it kept the exact layout, this meant that B was farther away from your thumb than A. So in, like, say, a Mario game, you'd have to curl your finger in weirdly to press the B button and hold it down so you could run, and then the A button is just awkwardly placed. I kind of wish that they had swapped it around for this redesign, but I think it is worthy of being placed alongside the NES because it fixed basically any other issues that were remaining with the NES, and while it does bring up its own unique new issue, I still think that it's important to give credit where it is due. Then we have the mini consoles. And I think of the mini consoles in the exact same way of they're very neat, but I kind of wanted a bit more out of them. Like, this is the very first time that Nintendo had re-released any sort of NES or Famicom consoles at the time, and they're basically the exact same as their earlier counterparts, but preloaded with 30 games. And as much as 30 games may sound, some of that roster is a little bit filler, I'll say. Like, it's got a lot of the games you would expect. Donkey Kong, Mario 1, 2, and 3, Zelda 1 and 2, and over here in America, we also got Punch-Out, Bubble Bobble, Kid Icarus, games that are really amazing, but there's definitely some ones that I'm surprised didn't make it on there. Like, there's no Tetris. Like, basically every console in the world can play Pac-Man in some way. Heck, your phone can do it pretty easily. Also, we here in the West just got some absolutely terrible games. Like Tecmo Bowl, or Castlevania 2, and you know what? I'll say it. Donkey Kong Jr. I don't like Donkey Kong Jr. Hot take. But, yeah. Overall, I definitely think that these are amazing time wasters. They're definitely not ones that I'll bust out super frequently, but they do make for amazing shelf pieces, and if nothing else, they're neat to at least own, to just say, this is a thing I have. And then we have the Super Famicom. And the Super Famicom is basically everything the NES was, but better. Better controllers, more buttons on said controllers so you could do more actions or program more things in. You also had better looking games, better sounding games, the earliest signs of 3D anywhere with games like Star Fox. And, yeah, just absolute marvels of technology. And there is a reason why most people consider this to be the best video game console ever. Like, I've seen people say that even modern gaming does not compare to the marvel that is the Super Famicom and the Super NES. Now, as usual, I haven't played the Japanese console at all, so I can't say too much about it, but I don't think anyone will disagree with me when I put both consoles in the top of the list, especially considering that by this point Japan had figured out that disconnectable controllers are good, and American developers had figured out that top loading is good. So, yeah, absolutely amazing consoles, and they genuinely were fantastic. Then we got a peripheral in the form of the Satellaview. Now, for those who don't know what the Satellaview is, I don't blame you. It was exclusive to Japan, but basically what this was you'd connect the Super Famicom to the Satellaview on the bottom down there, and you would then put in that black cartridge, which would allow you to connect to the internet, and you could download games to play for a short amount of time. This was a very experimental thing that didn't really amount to all that much at the very end, but it was still a very interesting experiment and one of the first examples of online gaming in a sort of way. For instance, the main game I think of when I think of the Satellaview is Fire Emblem Arcanea Saga, where for, I believe, 3 hours at a time, one of the 4 episodes would be available for you to download and play, where you would take the role of various characters in one of 4 maps as you attempt to earn a high score. This was done by leveling up characters and gaining stat points, gaining gold, defeating enemies and clearing objectives, and it was a unique and interesting experience for the time. Now, do I think it's amazing? No. Considering it was never even considered to leave Japan, I don't think it could be all that great, especially considering that a lot of the games are just not that amazing. Oftentimes, the games that would be available for download were kind of like ROM hacks for already existing games, like BS The Legend of Zelda. So, it's not an amazing thing, and definitely not something that I would consider to be, like, amazing gaming. I think the biggest disappointment when it comes to the Satellaview is that, technically speaking, all of the games that were designed for it, to my knowledge, are lost to the ages and can only be found again maybe through emulation, but I don't know if emulating these games are possible. But I really do hope that at some point, even if it's only exclusive to Japan, a complete collection of Satellaview games comes out, because they were really impressive. I didn't mention this earlier, but when I was talking about BSFE, what I didn't bring up is that the game is fully voice acted. Meaning, yes, this game was the first fully voice acted Fire Emblem game before any others. And I think that deserves recognition and should be shown to the masses in this day and age. Maybe instead of putting out a Nintendo console version of it, they could just do a application like they're doing for the Virtual Boy and stuff like that. I think that'd be a great idea. But as for the Satellaview itself, it's okay. Yeah, I'll say it's okay. And then we have this thing. The SNS 101 is a revision of the Super Nintendo that changes just about nothing. It swaps from the buttons, as seen above, into smaller ones that are moved to the very left. The console overall is smaller, and it no longer has ports on the bottom. The ports on the bottom were holdovers from the Super Famicom that allowed it to attach to the Satellaview, and that was removed from this iteration. They were on the Super NES, maybe because they planned to do something with them, but they eventually never did, and when the SNS came out, that didn't have it at all. It was basically confirmed that they weren't doing anything with that. It's kind of just another Super Nintendo, so when comparing it to the other Super Nintendo, it's weird because there's nothing stands out about this. It's just a Super Nintendo, but smaller and slimmer. So, especially because it doesn't really have an appealing design, it looks like a bootleg. I'm going to put it in a digital disaster, I think. It feels like a Super NES from an alternate timeline. Now we're going on to some more interesting peripherals, like the Super Game Boy and the Super Game Boy 2. These were neat little tools you could plug onto your Super Nintendo's or Super Famicom's cartridge port, and you could then play your Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on the TV. As far as I can tell, the only thing that differentiates the Super Game Boy 2 and the original is, of course, the design, but also the fact that the Super Game Boy 2 has a link cable for trading Pokemon and a internal oscillator, which makes it so the games run as they would on a traditional Game Boy instead of running as fast as the console itself. Now, I think the Super Game Boy is... I think the Super Game Boy is a baseline game machine because it does a really cool thing in not only allowing you to play Game Boy games if you didn't own a Game Boy. So if your friend told you about how amazing, let's say, Link's Awakening was, but you didn't own a Game Boy, then you could pick up the Super Game Boy and play it on your TV. So that was an inherent advantage of the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy 2, on the other hand, feels entirely pointless. Like, it was created in response to Japanese players complaining that they couldn't trade Pokemon, but I don't know, it seems pointless. It has a sleeker design, I'll say, because see-through plastic is always fun, but it's just kind of redundant, I'll say. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. And then we have, of course, the Super NES Mini and the Super Famicom Mini, which are the exact same as the Nintendo Mini and Famicom Mini, but for the Super Nintendo. I will say that while they do have less games overall, it does have the advantage of being the only place you could get Star Fox 2, a game that didn't release originally, but they decided to give it a new life onto here, which is honestly really cool that they added a game that never released onto here. It does have less games overall, but I personally think the selection of games is better this time around. It has fantastic role-playing games like Final Fantasy III or Earthbound, awesome platformers like Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World. It also has action-adventure games like Super Metroid or A Link Between Worlds. It also has Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem if you're playing the Famicom Mini, which is probably one of the better games in the series. But definitely, I think they cooked a bit better, you know? There's no game on the lineup I would exclusively call bad. Except for the fact that the Japanese Super Famicom has Super Soccer, and honestly, I've never heard of this game before, and I don't think anyone cares about it, so bit of a waste of time there, but other than that, pretty solid lineup of games all around. So I think that these mini consoles are just as good as the previous generation's mini consoles. I'll definitely say that they definitely went for quality over quantity, and I considered pushing them up into Sublime, but still, there's only 21 games on the consoles, and while they are amazing games that can certainly hold your attention for a long time, a little extra would have been nice. But hey, for what they are, they're absolutely amazing, and I'm curious to see if we'll ever see more of these in the future. Speaking of more of these in the future, the Virtual Boy. Oh boy. Now, I have never played a Virtual Boy before, but I don't think I need to... I don't really think it's a secret to say that basically everyone clowns on the Virtual Boy. It gives people headaches. It didn't have a whole lot of games to get released for it. It's kind of terrible, and it's also not super portable. But I definitely think that there was an idea here that Nintendo tried to capitalize on. They just did it poorly. Now, recently, the Virtual Boy has been brought up in discussion again because Nintendo decided to re-release the games with a Nintendo Switch 2 bonus. And a lot of people are complaining because they think that the games are terrible. Why should they be preserved? And honestly, I think that's really lame because even if they are bad games, shouldn't we be more in favor of preservation of these things? And yes, you need to purchase a Nintendo Switch Online subscription and the peripheral, which there's a lot of barriers to entry, I will admit, that I probably won't even end up getting myself. But you know what? There's an attempt here to preserve a piece of gaming history. And while that doesn't save it, I definitely think that it should be noted as a pro-consumer move in the very least. Still doesn't save this, though. I have heard that there are some pretty good games on here. Like, I think I've heard good things about the Tetris game that released onto this console. And the Wario platformer on here had a lot of interesting gameplay mechanics. But, yeah, for the most part, I don't think it saves the console itself. Then we move on to the N64. Now, the Nintendo 64 was not the very first 3D console, as I believe the 3DO came out first, as well as, of course, the PlayStation. But right out the gate, Nintendo did things that no one else was doing, and that paid off immensely. Not only did it have an analog stick on the controller, something that PlayStation wouldn't attempt until much later with the DualShock controllers, the console had a control stick right out the gate, and while the three-pronged system is weird, it is substance over style because you can either hold it by the outermost prongs for D-pad and C buttons, or you can hold it in the middle and the right to have a joystick system. It also had 4-player multiplayer right out of the box, so the second you tear this baby open, if you had the controllers for it, you could plug them all in and play with up to 3 friends, something that the PlayStation didn't have ever really, and would be forced to use peripherals instead. So when it came to multiplayer, Nintendo absolutely kicked Sony's butt. Additionally, it has some of the most monumentally important video games in all of history. Mario 64 was the first video game to give us full analog controls. Ocarina of Time is still hailed by many as the best video game of all time. And Donkey Kong 64 has driven players insane trying to collect it, and I mean that's gotta be worth something. However, this is where my praise for the console starts to end, as I have a lot of gripes with the N64. Now, while I have had some playtime with inherited NESs and SNESs, my grandma gave me her N64, and I played quite a lot of it. And I have a lot of gripes with this console. For starters, the joystick, while it was the very first of its kind, so some leverage has to be given for it, it's a terrible controller. Not only is it sharp around the edges, so continuous playtime can really dig into your thumbs, or God forbid we bring up Mario Party. I think that the best way to describe the N64 is that it should be preserved, but I personally won't be playing much of its roster anymore, because many of the games I think have aged tremendously terrible. Like Mario 64, as amazing as everyone calls it out to be, 100%ing the game is a painful experience, especially because the difficult platforming segments just feel terrible to control. Additionally, games like GoldenEye didn't quite have a grasp on how these games should be played, so they had really weird control styles. And while that could be either blamed on the games themselves, or even someone being like, Cal, don't blame the games, they were the first of their attempt. Similar things could be said about the games from the NES and the SNES, and in my personal belief, there is more reason to go back and play the NES and SNES than the N64. It was a monumental occasion and something absolutely revolutionary, but I personally believe it let people down a little bit, especially because of the fact that it still used cartridges, which didn't have anywhere near the amount of space a disc had, and since it couldn't use discs, many games just entirely skipped over it. The reason why Final Fantasy VI was the last Final Fantasy game on Nintendo consoles for years was because Square Enix attempted to tell Nintendo that a new Final Fantasy, especially the one they were planning on developing, couldn't fit on a cartridge, and so recommended them swapping to discs. But the president of Nintendo at the time didn't agree with such a claim, and so they stuck with cartridges because they were harder to pirate. So Final Fantasy flew the coop over to PlayStation, and Nintendo would not get another Final Fantasy game until ever, really, because most mainline Final Fantasies just haven't come to Nintendo consoles, outside of that weird, chibi Final Fantasy 15. The N64 I'll call Nintendo's first real trip. It was an amazing trip, one where after being tripped up, they do a front flip, but they still landed on the ground hard, and that really hurt them going into the next generation. So I'll probably give the N64 baseline. It's not... honestly, I do think I'm going to put it into course console, because it's not... It has a lot of issues, and a lot of the only defenses people can come up with this console is that it was of its time. And when you see games from the SNES and the NES being way more fun to go back to than games on this console, I can understand why I defended this console less and less as time goes on. It was revolutionary, but it definitely aged poorly. And then there's the N64DD, or disk drive, which is basically the exact same thing as the Famicom disk drive, but for the N64. And this thing was even worse than the Famicom disk drive. It, straight up had, 4 games. And it also didn't make it to the West either because it bombed in Japan, unlike the Famicom disk drive. So, yeah, I think it's probably for the best that it's forgotten. Again, the preservationist in me is like, well, maybe the game should be re-released somehow, and maybe they should be, but maybe in a way that doesn't involve a clunky piece of crap like this was. Then we move on to a very interesting piece of technology, the iQ player. This console was released in 2003, and was basically Nintendo's attempt to curb the rampant piracy that was going on in China at the time. So what they did was they set up this, the iQ controller, which had games downloaded directly on to the controller itself. So you would go out and find a kiosk, insert your memory card, and download a game directly onto this, and then you could go home and play it. It's a really interesting bit of technology, and while it technically came out after the GameCube, I decided to rank it before the GameCube simply because it's still basically just an N64 in a box. And because it's basically an N64 in a box, it's nothing amazing. But I do think that the controller design is, ironically enough, better than N64 baseline. You know, it's a much more standard controller shape, and the control stick is in a much smarter location. And then we move on to my darling, my beloved GameCube. I grew up on the GameCube and the Wii, but mostly the GameCube, to be totally honest. I spent so many hours playing darn near perfect video games, like Super Smash Bros. Melee. I also had the Ocarina of Time collector's disc that came with Wind Waker. I had Harvest Moon. I had Kirby Air Ride. I had so many timeless games that I honestly believe that the GameCube is one of the most timeless consoles in existence. Plus, Nintendo finally perfected the controller design. And while a lot of people still say that the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 have better controllers, no, I disagree. That these controllers feel absolutely perfect. All the buttons are in perfect range of your thumbs. They have the C-stick at the right angle to look around in games. They have really fun colors, and colors are fun. This is proven by scientific fact. Plus, there's a reason why if you look at basically any controller these days, they look a lot like the GameCube. While they may move the buttons around a little bit, it's basically the standard outside of Sony's controllers because Sony has to be different. Control stick in the top left, look stick in the bottom right, buttons at the top right, D-pad in the bottom left. And then you have the shoulder buttons and the ZL and ZR buttons, though this controller only had a Z button on the right. This console is legitimately close to perfect, because while it did still have flaws, like Nintendo using non-standard discs instead of normal discs, that's basically the only complaint I can bring up. Plus, it had probably one of my most missed features when it comes to modern games, in that you could open up your memory card if you didn't have a disc inserted at the time, when you turn the console on, and there were little icons that represented all the games you had saved onto the console at the time, which is something I dearly miss. I think that was a neat, fun little bit of technology that we are just missing out on these days. I think that this was one of Nintendo's best consoles, even if it sold poorly, but I attribute a lot of that to coming out at the same time, or around the same time, as the PS2, and that thing dominated. Next up, we have the Game Boy Player. Now, the Game Boy Player was basically a successor to the Super Game Boy, in that you inserted something into the console's controller region, that being a disc, and then you popped on the black attachment at the bottom, which allowed you to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advanced games, right on your TV. Now, I didn't grow up with this specific attachment, but, once again, the ability to play games from a console you may not own or may have broken, as well as being able to play these games with a backlight, because TVs have backlights, is not to be understated. I definitely think that it's one of the better attachments, and because it allows you to play all Game Boy games, including the new Game Boy Advance games, I think I'm going to put it up in Amazing Time Waster. It's not something that you'd probably want to play over some other games, unless there was a title you were really jiving on, but, you know, it's wonderful, I think, and it definitely helped make the GameCube feel more like the ultimate Nintendo machine. And then we got this weird creature, the Panasonic GameCube, which was basically a Japanese exclusive console that had access to GameCube games and allowed you to play DVDs, which meant that it could compete with the PlayStation, but the problem was that the PlayStation 2 had come out long before this console did, and it only came out in Japan, so I can't give it too much credit. Also, while the GameCube design is very nice and very aesthetically pleasing, I think that this looks like a washing machine or a printer, and I just don't think it looks all that great. Still, neat bit of technology. And then, the Wii. Oh my god, the Wii. This is one of the best-selling consoles of all time. And there is a very good reason for that. Because it was a game console everyone could play. If you weren't that much of a hardcore gamer, there were plenty of casual games to entertain your time and spend time playing with the family, like Wii Sports and Wii Play, very simple, not too complex games. It also had games that were more geared towards, video game players, like Smash Bros. And Xenoblade Chronicles. Absolutely fantastic games. And it had a killer marketing scheme that just absolutely worked. Now, a lot of people will complain about the motion controls, and maybe this is because I grew up with them, and so naturally my brain is just used to their funkiness, but I don't see that much of a problem using these controls for what the games entail. Plus, I think that in some ways they could really enhance a game's, well, everything. I don't see a lot of people wanting to play the GameCube version of Twilight Princess, because while yes, some may say that waggling the controller is unorthodox, it's fun. It's fun to swing your sword and actually do the cool slashes on the screen. It's cool to press the B button to draw your bow and fire at enemies who were far off in the distance. It's genuinely a cool bit of technology. And while yes, this did leave the door open for a lot of slop, it's still a good console at the end of the day. Plus, even if you weren't a fan of Wii games and all their waggling, it was fully backwards compatible with GameCube games. The very first Nintendo console that could do that with the previous generation's games. And that also made the console just work a lot better for people, because you didn't need to go out and buy a crap ton of new Wii games to feel like your console meant something, because you could use it to play the games you already loved, like Metroid or Wind Waker or, again, Smash Bros. A lot of people clown on the Wii nowadays for all of its waggling, but I think that it gave the console a bit of life that can only be truly represented by reminding you of how people tried to capitalize on it. Like, does anyone remember using a Kinect, which was Microsoft's response to the Wii? It was pretty terrible. And while I've heard some people say that the Sony alternative, the PlayStation Move, worked better than a Wii, it definitely didn't have the same staying power. You still see people reference the Wii nowadays in, like, movies and TV shows and stuff, and nobody's talking about the PlayStation Move. That is why, in my opinion, the Nintendo Wii is a amazing time waster. I will say that probably a lot of my love for this console comes from nostalgia, so I probably shouldn't rank it into the Sublime system, because again, there was a lot of shovelware for this console. But the games it did have that genuinely put love and effort and time into the games, it showed. And this console produced some of my favorite games ever. I would not be a Xenoblade fan had they not released Xenoblade 1 onto this console, because, well, if they hadn't done that, then it wouldn't have been able to be remastered for later consoles, which is where I picked it up. I think this was a very experimental time for Nintendo, and the experimentation worked because it dominated the landscape. Next up we have the Nintendo Wii Family, which was basically a more budget option for people who wanted a Wii, but didn't want to spend the full amount. It removed GameCube functionality and knocked itself over onto its side, but other than that, didn't really have much else going for it. It's basically just a Wii, but on its side, and while it does allow you to play any and all Wii games, it still just doesn't have a whole lot going for it. It is cool looking because it's black, and personally I think black is a bit of a cooler color than white. Yeah, just not great. It still lets you play every Wii game, so it's not inherently bad, but it's not great. I don't know why I put this here, but next we have the Wii Mini, which was released after the Wii U, but I'm gonna rank it here, and it's basically the exact same thing as the Wii Family, but it removed even more things like an SD drive and USB ports. So it was the cheapest Wii ever, and basically the only thing it could do was play Wii games. That was it. And I think it's about the same as the Wii Family. Again, if you wanted to play Wii games, it was cheap and available, but still, I mean, it's inherently less cool than the Wii itself. Next up, we have the Wii U, and it's not going in the upper tier list, but it is not going to be forgotten or a disaster, because as someone who played a lot of the Wii U, I think it did have its benefits. I played a lot of Nintendo Land and Smash Bros. And it even gave us a new horror game in the form of Zombie U, which was okay, I heard. I myself never actually played it. I was like 12, so I wasn't allowed to play it. But yeah, I think that a lot of people dunk on the Wii U because it didn't sell a whole lot, and not for the actual quality of anything itself. The Wii U gamepad is actually incredibly fun to play and hold. It's beefy and chunky, and that's not a horrible thing when it comes to controllers. And I really like the sticks and the button. It was my preferred controller whenever we played Smash Brothers. And while not a whole lot of games utilized the bottom screen a whole lot, it did have some games that took real advantage of that. Like, again, the aforementioned Nintendo Land. That was a great showing of what the Wii U could do, allowing for asymmetrical multiplayer in the same room. Now, of course, I'm aware of all of its faults, all of the dumb things Nintendo did, but it was a cool idea, and it was something that makes me a little bit sad, because we'll probably never get anything like this ever again. You know, a smaller screen separate from the console, because I really don't think that Nintendo is gonna move away from the Switch style, where it's both a home console and portable. I think Microsoft is about to take themselves out of the console gaming thing just in general, and I don't foresee Sony trying this, especially because it didn't work out for Nintendo. If it had made them a lot of money, I could have definitely seen Sony trying to copy it, but especially because it flopped, I don't think that it's going to try something like this. And next we have the portable games. We're going to cover the Switch and Switch 2 in a minute, but yeah. First up, we have the Game Boy. And some people like to dunk on the Game Boy for being like, man, people were playing these things? These were like entertainment? But I think that those people are looking at it in the wrong sense, because something that I even forget is that the Game Boy came out 4 years after the NES. Before the Super Nintendo, before even like the Sega Genesis, there was a essentially NES you could take on the go. And while yes, it didn't have a backlight and it required 4 AAA batteries, it was still a monumental thing. It was one of the first readily available portable consoles that wasn't like a Tiger Electronics, and it had some solid games. This is where Tetris got its start, for Christ's sake. And while a lot of the older games are pretty mixed, I don't really see anyone calling for a Super Mario Land port, the games were good for what they were. Again, some people will argue with, well, a lot of the games ported to this console were bad. Yeah, but are we really going to judge a console by its port of Mortal Kombat 3? Are we really going to do that? I think that this is a fine gaming peripheral and is one of the more important gaming machines. Now, of course, this isn't just importance, and I think that there's no real reason to go back to, especially the original Game Boy. But if it wasn't for this, we wouldn't have had Pokemon, so that's got to be worth something. Next up, we have the various Game Boy modifications. This one here on the left being the Pocket, and the one on the right being the Lite. Now, the Pocket was basically a smaller Game Boy, and while it did have less runtime, it only requires 2 AAA batteries instead of the 4 AA's of the Game Boy. So that's got to be worth something, you know? Even if it's a little less runtime, I believe it's like 12 hours compared to the Game Boy's 15. That's still pretty good and is a absolute essential for car rides. And it's basically the exact same otherwise. Now, the Game Boy Light had a backlight and was the first Game Boy to really offer that. It only came out in Japan, but, for giving players a backlight, I think that is something worth praising. I really do. I kind of want to put this in Course Console because I think this could have been sold worldwide, and if it had been, it would have been remembered much more fondly, but I do think I'll just put it in Baseline because it allowed players to see their games at night or without, like, one of those little floppy light attachments, so it did the job it needed. This is a Game Boy Pikachu mini console. It basically was a pedometer that let you take care of a Pikachu. I don't know why it's on here. This seems like a footnote. Even funnier is that there was a sequel to this that for some reason isn't on the tier list, so I don't want to walk places. I want to play video games. Next up we have the Game Boy Color, which was basically the exact same as the Game Boy, but now the games had color. And instead of being in either monochrome or pea green, and that's the food pea, not the pea. Not only did it have its own list of exclusive games, but it could also play every single Game Boy game, and being able to see your games in color was pretty neat. It still didn't have a backlight, but you know what? It was a step forward, I will say. So I will put it with all the other Game Boys because it's not quite to the Amazing Time Waster, I'll say. But it is a pretty good console. Also, I don't know what this red Game Boy is here. I couldn't find it on any wikis. I assume it's just a recolor of the Game Boy Color. So I will put this specific iteration into Forgotten for a reason, because I don't even know what it is. But then we get on to the original Game Boy Advance. And much like how the Game Boy was a portable NES, the Game Boy Advanced was a portable Super Nintendo. And you already know that I think the Super Nintendo is better than the base NES. So, yeah, obviously the Game Boy Advance is going to be better than the Game Boy. Not only is it compatible with all Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, but you now had an L and R button for extra buttons to press. You had a lot more visually creative games that could do a lot more interesting things. You had unique cartridges, so you could do things like rotating the console to do things, or a console that could tell what the time was for certain games. The Game Boy Advanced is incredibly amazing, and it only ran on 2 AA batteries. This was how I first played Fire Emblem Blazing Blade, and the lack of backlight was annoying. It speaks to the quality of the Game Boy Advance's library that I was willing to, in the modern day, put up with a Game Boy Advance to play those games. The faults didn't matter. The games were that good. And what's even better than the Game Boy Advance, than the Game Boy Advanced SP. Dude. These were darn near borderline perfect. Like, I understand that consoles are inherently superior to portable gaming, but, like, dude, they knocked it out of the park with this. That clamshell design so it could be both a full gaming system and snugly tucked away into a pocket. It had a backlight finally so you could see all your games, and it was still a Game Boy Advance, and it still had the ability to play all Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. There is basically no reason to play a Game Boy Advance over a Game Boy Advance SP, because it's just better. And I love it. And then we've got the Game Boy Micro, which is a oddity. I don't really get what the point of the Game Boy Micro was. By the time it came out, you could play Game Boy games on a Game Boy Advance SP, and you could also play them on a DS, which was out at the time. And even if it was only advanced games and not color or base Game Boy games, you could still play them. And if it was just about experiencing the games themselves for cheap, well, the Game Boy Player was available for about the same price, so I don't understand what the point of this is. Like, it has interchangeable faceplates. I don't think that's enough to recommend picking it up then, especially not now. And its screen is even smaller than the Game Boy Advance. It's a weird little console. It is a disaster. Then we have the DSs. And honestly, I'm just going to put all the DSs up here because there's not that much differences between all of them. There's very minor specifications, like I think this one got rid of the headphone port, and these two could not play Game Boy Advance games at all. They removed the Game Boy Advance port. But the DSs were very gimmicky, but they were still amazing portable consoles. Now, I will argue that they were probably a bit of a trip up compared to, at least from my experience and the games I played, they were a lot more shovelware than the Wii. Like, there was definitely more shovelware for the Wii, but a lot of DS games I played just absolutely sucked because a lot of games took use of the touchscreen in unfun ways, and like SpongeBob was not that fun to play on the DS because it had a lot of touchscreen mechanics, which I didn't like. And if I, in my young age, could enjoy Monkey Mischief Circus Time and not SpongeBob, then I think that goes to show the quantity over quality thing was definitely more applicable to the DSs. Now, they were still good consoles. There were still absolutely amazing games for them. Mario Kart DS. I'll even say Mario Kart 64 DS. But they did have more flaws than the Wii. I'm going to put this specific model up here with the amazing Time Wasters because it could run Game Boy Advance games as well, so you could have your DS games and your Game Boy Advance games in. But these I'll put down here. I spent a lot of time with the DS line of games, with the DS line of consoles, but they're not quite as good in my memory than in comparison to the Wii. Next up we have the 3DS consoles, and I'll be honest, these consoles kind of blend in a bit more than the different Game Boy versions. Like, the Game Boy version had different battery specs, it had different size screens, and even had some exclusive games for different versions. But most of the redesigns from out here are basically one and the same. You've got the basic 3DS, the bigger 3DS, and then the flat 2DS. And these consoles are definitely something that I think a lot of people agree fumbled out the starting gate, but turned around and became one of the best consoles for portable gaming. You know, this thing came out before the Vita, and it lasted so much longer than the Vita. And it has an amazing roster of games. I know a lot of people dislike the circle pad, but I think it works for the type of console that Nintendo was making and was the best they could do for a stick on the go. And because of the stick, we had full 3D games. And a large portion of the roster of this console's gaming library was games that we had already seen before, given brand new life. This is where we got the amazing remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. This is where we got a real sort of 3D Mario game in 3D land. This is where Fire Emblem crawled its way out of obscurity into being a mainline in a Nintendo series. It's where we got the SMT franchises, and there are honestly, the 3DS is a amazing RPG machine. If you love RPGs, track down a 3DS and have a blast replaying so many great role-playing games. Now, as for the consoles themselves, I think that the 3DS goes about here-ish, because I'll say here because a lot of the stuff that it tried to do is worse, I'll say, than the DS at launch. Like the 3D, I don't know anyone who cared about that thing more than just flicking it when you're bored playing something else. And in fact, the 2DS line of consoles just didn't have that at all. The 3DS XL is a bit better, I will say, because it's bigger, and thus you can see more of your game, and it just felt a bit nicer to hold than the base 3DS. And the 2DS I'll put in coarse, honestly, because its lack of folding and just being a brick did not do the console any favors. Then for the 3DS XL line, which was not only bigger, but also had amiibo functionality, it had a little nub you could mess around with for certain games, and even exclusive games for it. These I just don't have a whole lot more to say about, because they don't really change too much. Like, I think the nub allows you to use taunts in Smash Bros. And it allows you to move the camera in Xenoblade Chronicles. But overall, they're just better versions of an already good system. So I will put these guys up in amazing time wasters. Fun fact, the new Nintendo 2DS XL is actually my current DS console. I have it outfit with a grip, so I can so it's got like controller grips on the side of it, but yeah, it's got really good battery life. And while the audio ports are a little weirdly placed, the grip helps with that. It has the nub for all the games that require the nub, and it's just a sleek looking console. I love the black and blue on this thing, like legitimately. It is probably my favorite version of the 3DS, because it can do everything all of the others can, and in my opinion, it looks the best out of all the new 3DSs. Plus, because it can fold, it can now be more easily transported, and it, of course, has access to not breaking in half whenever you drop it. Then, finally, we have the Nintendo Switches. And Nintendo's back on their feet, I will say. After the Wii U, a lot of people were very concerned about Nintendo's future. And then they were like, hey guys, how about we give you both a portable gaming console and a home console at the same time? And what if we release, within the first year of this game's life, the best Zelda game that has come out in most people's eyes, and the best Mario game, period, within the first year? And from that point on, the Switch was just absolutely unstoppable. I know that some people don't like the Joy-Cons, and there are some legitimate complaints about them, like stick drift. It's a real problem. But this system just absolute powerhouse. It is so good. Not only do you have access to a crap ton of games that were ported to Nintendo for the first time ever, you had these games portably before the Steam Deck, long before it, I'll say. And so you had access to amazing first-party Nintendo titles like the aforementioned Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, and Smash Bros. As well. You also had access to amazing games people love, like Skyrim or The Witcher, and all of that was just in the first year of the console's life. From that point on, Nintendo was firing on all cylinders to give you amazing titles. Like, as a Fire Emblem fan, they gave me Fire Emblem Warriors, which is a celebration of pieces of the series in a fun Dynasty Warriors game. And then they gave us Fire Emblem Three Houses, which was the first console Fire Emblem since the 9th entry, and is regaled by many as the best in the series. And then you had Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes, which was a sort of alternate universe to Fire Emblem that was another Warriors game. And then you had Fire Emblem Engage, which was another role-playing game. So, even in just the Fire Emblem circle that I'm in, I had access to quite a bit of options when it came to what I want to play. And then branching out from there, you had all sorts of Mario spin-offs that probably people would never expect. Like, would you have expected a duology of XCOM-esque Mario games? And while you probably wouldn't expect that, we got that. Would you have expected a sequel to the amazing Zelda game that just refines and enhances all of the mechanics already seen in that? No, you probably wouldn't, but you got it anyways. Did you expect the entire Xenoblade series playable on this one console? Did you expect Doom to excel on here? Did you expect a whole bunch of other amazing high-quality games for portable? No. And yet, we got them. The Nintendo Switch is probably the best-selling console ever outside of, all those mysterious PlayStation 2 sales they keep finding. And I think it just speaks a lot about how quality the Nintendo Switch is that the new Nintendo console has come out, and people don't feel a need to upgrade because they still have the Nintendo Switch. Of course, then we have the portable-only micro Switch, and then we have the Switch OLED, which are basically modifications. Losing access to be able to play it on the screen at a massive price cut is nice, but it's probably not a Nintendo Switch I will ever pick up, because I really enjoy being able to dock the Switch itself. And I don't personally own an OLED, but for those who want to play the game in better while portable, that is definitely an option people can go for. And then, of course, we have the Nintendo Switch 2, which is a very contentious console. Now, I personally do not own one because I don't have the funds to pick up a new console, but I definitely see a lot of the complaints people have had towards the Nintendo Switch 2, but I think that some of the complaints are overdramatic. Now, I don't have access to the Switch 2, so I can't check for myself whether or not the controllers are weirdly sized, like I've heard some people say. And yeah, the prices are kind of ridiculous. But I have heard that it is a good console. I will put it in Amazing Time Waster for now. Maybe whenever I eventually get my hands on it, I'll come back and leave a comment on this video specifically to just update you on how I feel about this thing. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. And then, to round off the tier list, the Game & Watch Mario and Zelda Anniversary games. These were released for the 35th anniversary of Mario and Zelda, respectively, and are basically little Game & Watch games that had a clock, and more importantly, games on them. With the Mario one, you had access to Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, as well as a modified version of the Game & Watch game Ball, while the Zelda one had The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and Link's Awakening, as well as a clock. As well as the third Game & Watch game, Vermin, but with a Zelda skin. These are honestly pretty neat things. I don't really see a need to purchase these, but these are really cool little devices, especially because they just give you access to portable versions of what may be some of your favorite games. I think that they're, yeah. For what they're worth, they're good, but I definitely could see why some would ignore them. And there you have it, folks. The completed Nintendo console and handheld tier list. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Did I put the Panasonic GameCube too high or too low? Do you think the Virtual Boy deserves to be forgotten about? And is the Nintendo Switch 2 sublime? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you nerds next time.